Okay, so for this deep dive, you guys have sent in a ton of stuff about network architecture and security.
Yeah, a lot of material.
I mean, we've got the basics, like the actual hardware, right? All the way to how to like really lock down your networks,
Yeah.
whether they're, sitting in a server room somewhere or floating up in the cloud.
Right, exactly.
So where do we even begin with all of this?
Well, I think we got to start with the fundamentals, right?
Yeah.
Like, what are the pieces of the puzzle?
Okay.
So we're talking about those network devices, things like wireless access points, switches, routers, that kind of stuff.
Okay, yeah, the basic building blocks.
Right.
But you know what? It's funny because even though this might seem like, networking 101 to a lot of people listening,
Uh-huh.
really understanding what each of these things actually does, like at a deeper level,
Yeah.
it's actually super important if you want to grasp the whole security picture, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because you can't
Yeah.
secure what you don't understand.
Right, exactly.
So let's break it down, starting with wireless access points.
Okay, so think of these as like the bridge, between your wired network, all the cables and stuff, and all those devices that use Wi-Fi.
Right, like our phones, laptops.
Exactly, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Now, they work at what's called layer 2 of the OSI model, which is just a fancy way of saying the data link layer.
Okay.
And their main job is to manage the flow of traffic based on the device's unique hardware address, which is called a massee adjacent.
Okay, so that's how they know where to send stuff.
Right, it's like each device has its own unique ID card, and the access point checks that ID to make sure it's allowed on the network.
Makes sense.
So it's like a bouncer at a club, right?
Yeah, okay.
Checking IDs at the door.
Yeah,
But for your Wi-Fi,
I like it. Yeah.
makes it a bit more relatable.
So then we have switches.
Right, so these guys, they're like the traffic directors within your wired network.
Okay.
Every computer, printer, server that's plugged in, with a cable, it all goes through a switch. And the switch's job is to forward data, or frames, as they're called, between those devices. And again,
Yeah.
it's using those MC addresses we just talked about.
Gotcha.
So it keeps all communication nice and local, very efficient,
Right.
kind of like an internal mail system within an office building.
Okay, that's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
So everything's staying within the building,
Exactly.
and then we've got routers.
Right, so now we're talking about sending data beyond our own local network.
Out into the wild.
Exactly, out into the internet to
Yeah.
other networks.
Yeah.
And this is where routers come in. They operate at layer 3, the network layer. And they're not really concerned with MSE addresses anymore.
Okay.
Their world is all about logical addresses, which are called IP addresses.
Right, the IP address.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And routers, they make decisions about the best path to send your data across all these different networks.
Oh, okay.
They're kind of like a GPS for your data packets as they travel across the internet. Yeah, they figure out the most efficient route, avoid traffic jams, all that good stuff.
So we've got the hardware, the physical infrastructure down.
Right, the nuts and bolts.
But then it's the protocols, right?
Yeah.
It's like the languages that these devices speak that actually let them exchange information.
Exactly, the communication protocols.
And two of the big ones that we hear about all the time,
Yeah.
TCP and UDP.
Yeah.
Can you just quickly explain why those are so fundamental?
Yeah, so think of these protocols as the backbone of how different computers talk to each other,
Okay.
right? How applications on different devices exchange data.
Gotcha.
Now, TCP, which stands for Transmission Control Protocol, it's all about reliability. It makes sure that the connection is established before any data gets sent. It makes sure all the data arrives in the correct order.
Right.
And if anything gets lost along the way, it'll resend it.
Oh, okay.
So it's like sending a registered letter.
Okay.
You get confirmation when it arrives, and if it doesn't, they try again.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah, so it's all about making sure everything gets there safe and sound.
So accuracy and reliability are like TCP's trademarks.
Exactly.
Now, UDP sounds a little more, I don't know, kind of fast and loose.
Got it.
Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay.
UDP, User Datagram Protocol, it doesn't care about setting up a connection first. And it doesn't guarantee that all the data will arrive or even in the right order.
Okay.
It just sends it out there, kind of like throwing a bunch of darts at a dartboard and hoping they hit the target.
Okay.
But because it skips all that overhead of setting up a connection and confirming everything,
Right.
it's much faster.
Okay.
So it's ideal for things where speed is more important than perfect accuracy.
Gotcha.
Like think about streaming video or online gaming.
Okay.
A little bit of dropped data might cause a tiny glitch, but it's not a big deal.
Right.
It's much better than having everything lag because TCP is busy resending everything that might have gotten lost.
Yeah, you don't want lag when you're gaming. Okay, so we have the infrastructure, the communication methods.
Uh-huh.
Now, how does security start to, like, shape how we actually build and design these networks?
Right.
Because it can't just be about getting everything connected and talking to each other.
No, not at all.
There's got to be more to it, right?
Right. So from a security standpoint, there's a few big things that directly influence how a network is architected.
Okay.
So first and foremost is availability.
Right.
Making sure that the network and all the services that run on it, they're up and running whenever they're needed.
Makes sense.
Because downtime, even for a short period, it can cost an organization a lot of money and cause a lot of headaches.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, of course, there's always the factor of cost.
Uh-huh.
Implementing robust security measures, upgrading the network infrastructure to fix vulnerabilities, all that stuff, it's not free.
It's never free.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
And those financial realities, they play a big role in how architectural decisions are made, what trade-offs are acceptable.
Yeah, you got to balance security with practicality, right?
Exactly.
And there's another factor I think you mentioned earlier, risk transference.
Oh, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Because sometimes organizations might decide, okay, we're going to shift some of this risk to a third party. Maybe they'll get cybersecurity insurance.
Right.
Or they'll outsource certain security functions to a specialized company.
Okay.
And these decisions about how to manage risk, they can actually have a direct impact on the network architecture itself.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because it might influence which security controls are implemented internally versus relying on those external parties.
Right. It shifts the whole focus.
Exactly.
So let's get into some of the specific security mechanisms.
All right.
Like, how do things like VLANs or firewalls, how do those actually like physically affect the network structure and help create a more secure environment?
Right. So virtual local area networks, or VLANs for short, when you combine them with access control lists, ACLs, they become a really powerful tool for creating secure internal segments within your layer 2 network.
Okay, break that down a bit.
Sure. So think of a VLAN as a way to logically divide your physical network into smaller isolated networks.
Oh, okay.
So you might have devices that are physically connected to the same switches.
Right.
But with VLANs, you can prevent them from talking to each other unless it's explicitly allowed.
Okay.
And that's where ACLs come in.
Right.
Access control lists are essentially sets of rules that you apply to these VLANs.
Gotcha.
To control which traffic is allowed to flow between them.
So it's like creating separate walled-off departments within a building.
Exactly.
Yeah.
With strict rules about who can go where.
And that helps with security. How?
Well, it not only can improve network performance because there's less unnecessary traffic.
Right.
But it also really boosts security because it limits the potential damage if a security breach does happen.
Yeah.
If one segment of the network gets compromised, the attacker can't easily jump over to other more sensitive areas.
Right. They're contained.
Exactly. They're contained.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So VLANs create these isolated zones. What about web application firewalls? WAFs, we hear a lot about those in terms of, web security.
Right. So a WAF is specifically designed to protect web applications.
Okay.
It sits at the application layer, which is layer 7 of that OSI model.
Gotcha.
And its job is to inspect all the traffic coming in and out of the web application.
Okay.
Looking for things like SQL injection attacks, cross-site scripting, all those nasty web-based exploits.
Yeah, the stuff that can really cause trouble.
Exactly.
But a WAF doesn't actually segment the network in the same way that VLANs do, right?
Right. That's an important distinction.
Yeah.
It's focused on protecting the web application itself, not necessarily changing the underlying structure of the network.
So it's a vital piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
But it's not the whole puzzle.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about things like router ACLs and IPsec?
Okay, so router ACLs, as we mentioned earlier, they work at layer 3. They control the flow of traffic based on IP addresses and port numbers.
Gotcha.
IPsec, or Internet Protocol Security, it's a way to secure those IP communications by encrypting them and adding authentication.
Okay.
It's often used to create VPN tunnels, for example.
So both of those definitely enhance security.
Yeah.
But again, they're not fundamentally changing that network structure.
Right. They're adding layers of security on top of the existing structure.
Okay.
But if the underlying network is flat, meaning there's no segmentation,
Yeah.
there's still a risk that an attacker could move around laterally once they're inside.
So they might not be enough on their own.
Exactly.
And then there's the good old DMZ.
The demilitarized zone.
Yeah.
Classic security concept.
Yeah.
So a DMZ is basically a way to isolate those publicly accessible servers, like your web server, your email server, from your internal network.
Okay.
So it acts as a buffer zone.
Gotcha.
If one of those public-facing servers gets compromised,
yeah,
it makes it a lot harder for the attacker to then get into your more sensitive internal systems.
Right. They're kind of stuck in the DMZ.
Exactly. They hit a wall.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So with all these different security mechanisms, these layers, where are the most common weaknesses?
Right.
Like, where do attackers typically try to get that initial foothold?
Yeah, well, our sources point out that vulnerabilities can exist at different levels.
Okay.
Even at the very bottom, the physical layer, layer 1.
Oh, really?
Yeah, something as simple as an unauthorized physical connection.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, someone could just walk up and plug a device into a network port.
Oh, right, just physically plug in?
Exactly, or connect to an open Wi-Fi network.
Oh, wow.
And suddenly, they have access to the same network segment as legitimate users.
Yeah.
Especially if a network is poorly designed and there's no segmentation.
It's crazy how easy it can be sometimes.
It is.
Okay, so that's layer 1.
Yeah.
What about higher up the stack?
Okay, so at layer 3, a big risk is unauthorized devices obtaining valid IP addresses.
Okay, how does that happen?
Well, it can happen through different techniques.
Okay.
Like IP address spoofing if it's not properly mitigated.
Right.
And this allows attackers to potentially bypass security measures.
Oh, wow.
And communicate with different parts of the network as if they were a trusted device.
So they're basically impersonating a legitimate device.
Exactly.
That's scary. And then at layer 4 and layer 7, we're talking about open ports, right?
Right. This is a classic attack vector.
Yeah.
Attackers will scan networks looking for open ports, meaning those ports are listening for incoming connections.
Right.
And then they'll try to exploit vulnerabilities in the services that are running on those ports.
So it's like trying every door in a building to see if any are unlocked?
Exactly. They're looking for that weak point.
Okay, so that's a constant threat.
It is.
And now we got to talk about cloud security, because it's a whole different ballgame when you compare it to traditional on-premises environments.
It is. The responsibilities change.
Right.
So, in traditional setup, you're in control of everything.
Yeah.
The physical security of the data center, the network devices, the servers, all of it.
You're responsible for the whole stack.
Exactly, from the physical to the digital.
But in the cloud,
yeah,
it's a shared responsibility model, right?
Right, so the cloud provider, they take care of securing the physical infrastructure.
Okay.
The data centers, the hardware, all that.
Right.
But you, as the customer, you're still responsible for securing everything else.
Okay, like what?
Your data, the applications you deploy, the configurations you set up in the cloud environment.
So you can't just assume that the cloud provider is handling everything.
No, absolutely not.
You still have to be very proactive.
Yeah, you're still responsible for a lot.
So what are some of the essential security practices that are universal, whether you're in the cloud or on premises?
Okay, well, first and foremost, keeping your systems patched.
Okay, patching.
Yeah, regularly applying firmware updates to all your network devices.
Right.
Those updates often include crucial security fixes for newly discovered vulnerabilities.
Yeah, because new vulnerabilities are being discovered all the time.
Oh yeah, constantly.
Yeah, and you got to stay ahead of the game.
Absolutely. It's a never-ending race.
And what else is really important?
Encrypting your data, especially when it's traveling across the network.
Okay, data encryption.
Yeah, using technologies like TLS or IPsec.
Right.
To make sure that sensitive information can't be intercepted and read if it's snooped on.
Okay, so keep everything patched and keep the data scrambled.
Right. 2 fundamental principles.
What else?
The principle of least privilege.
Oh, yeah, we talked about that a bit earlier.
Yeah, so this is basically the idea that you only give users and systems the bare minimum access they need to do their jobs.
Right.
No more, no less.
And that limits the damage if something gets compromised?
Exactly, because even if an attacker gets in, they can't move around freely or access things they shouldn't.
So it's about containment.
Yeah, it's like damage control.
Makes sense.
And network segmentation, as we discussed earlier, it's also crucial in both environments.
Right, those isolated zones.
Exactly, and then controlling outbound traffic.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
So making sure that data isn't being secretly sent out of your network.
Oh, right, like data exfiltration.
Yeah, you want to prevent that.
And of course, backups.
Oh, backups are essential.
Yeah.
Especially with the rise of ransomware, you always need a way to restore your data if it gets encrypted or deleted.
So it's not just about preventing attacks, but also about being prepared if one happens.
Exactly. You need a plan B.
Okay, now let's talk about how we actually verify who's trying to get onto our networks.
Okay, authentication.
Right. Our sources mentioned EAP and RADIUS in this context. Can you explain how those protocols help with that authentication process?
Sure, so the Extensible Authentication Protocol, or EAP, it's not really a specific authentication method itself.
Okay.
It's more like a framework
Okay.
that allows for different authentication methods to be used.
Oh, okay, so it's flexible.
Exactly, it's very adaptable.
And what kind of methods are we talking about?
Well, it can support the traditional password-based authentication,
Right.
but it can also be used for more secure methods, like passwordless authentication with smart cards, for example.
Okay, that sounds more secure.
Yeah, and another key thing about EAP is that it often establishes a secure connection before any credentials are even transmitted.
Oh, okay, so it's secure from the get-go.
Exactly. It helps protect those credentials from being intercepted.
So EAP sets the stage, but who actually makes the decision about whether to let someone in or not?
Right. That's where RADIUS comes in.
Okay, RADIUS.
So the remote authentication dial-in user service protocol.
Well, it's a mouthful.
It is a bit of a mouthful.
But what does it do?
So it basically handles the communication between the device that's trying to authenticate the user.
Okay.
So that could be a wireless access point, a VPN gateway, something like that,
Right.
and a centralized authentication server,
Gotcha.
which is where all the user accounts and passwords are stored.
Okay.
And that RADIUS server, it's the one that makes the final decision.
Right, the ultimate authority.
Exactly.
Based on the user's credentials and the policies that have been set up.
Exactly. So it's all about verifying the user's identity and making sure they're authorized to access the network.
Now, one term that keeps popping up in these discussions is attack surface.
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean?
So imagine the attack surface as all the different points on your network, your systems, your applications,
Okay.
where an attacker could potentially try to gain entry.
Okay.
We're talking open ports, running services, user counts, vulnerabilities in software, even physical access points.
So it's a pretty broad concept.
It is. It encompasses a lot.
And why is minimizing that attack surface so important?
Because the fewer entry points you have,
Yeah.
the harder it is for attackers to get in.
Makes sense?
And if they do manage to compromise something, the amount of damage they can do is limited.
So it's about making yourself a less attractive target.
Exactly. You want to be that fortress with high walls and few gates.
Hard to get into.
Exactly.
So how do we go about shrinking that attack surface?
Right. So one of the most effective strategies is network segmentation.
Okay, we've talked about that.
Yeah, dividing your network into those separate secure zones.
Right.
Using VLANs, firewalls, things like that.
Gotcha.
So if one area is compromised, the damage is contained.
Right.
Another technique is dynamic port allocation.
Okay, what's that?
So instead of leaving network ports open all the time,
Yeah.
you only open them when they're needed by a specific application or service.
Okay.
And then you close them right away afterward.
Oh,
Because
okay.
an open port is like an open door. It's an invitation for an attacker to come knocking.
So close the doors you're not using.
Exactly.
Now, what are some of the things that people might think are helping,
Yeah.
but are actually risky or not that effective?
Okay, well, one big mistake is keeping all ports open.
Oh, really?
Yeah, sometimes people think, well, if I keep all the ports open, then all my applications work fine.
Right.
But that's really dangerous
Oh.
because it massively increases your attack surface.
Right, more open doors.
Exactly. And similarly, assigning static port numbers to all your applications.
What does that mean?
So instead of letting the system dynamically assign port numbers as needed,
Yeah.
you manually assign specific ports to each application.
Okay.
And while that might seem easier to manage,
Yeah.
it can actually make things predictable for attackers.
Oh, right. They know where to look.
Exactly. And firewalls are essential. But only having a firewall at the edge of your network isn't enough.
Right.
It's that perimeter defense, but you need internal segmentation as well.
Yeah, those layers of defense.
Exactly. And another mistake is focusing all your security efforts on your public-facing networks
Okay.
and neglecting your internal networks.
Right.
Because if an attacker gets past that perimeter, your internal assets are vulnerable.
Yeah, you can't forget about the inside.
And one last thing,
Yeah.
using the same password for everything,
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
it's so common, but it's so risky.
Right, because if one account is compromised,
Yeah.
they're all compromised.
Exactly. It's like using the same key for all your doors.
Not a good idea.
Not at all.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the digital stuff, but physical security is still important, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like actually locking the door to the server room still matters.
It does. Physical security is the foundation.
Okay.
Because if someone can physically access your equipment,
Yeah.
they can bypass all those digital security measures.
Right. They have direct access.
Exactly.
So what are the key things to keep in mind for physical security?
So you want to have physically isolated and secure areas for your critical equipment.
Okay.
In a data center, for example.
Yeah.
You want to restrict access to authorized personnel only.
Right.
And you can have additional measures like biometric scanners, CCTV cameras, security guards.
Right. All those extra layers.
But the most important thing is that physical isolation.
Yeah. Keep the bad guys out.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's talk more about firewalls.
Right.
Specifically layer 4 and layer 7 firewalls. What's the main difference between those?
So layer 7 firewalls, they're like the super sleuths of the firewall world.
Okay.
They can do deep packet inspection.
What does that mean?
They can actually look inside the packets of data.
Oh.
And analyze the contents.
Right.
So they can understand what applications are communicating, what commands they're using, what data they're exchanging.
Wow, so they're really smart.
Yeah, they're very sophisticated.
Okay.
And this makes them really good at catching application-specific attacks, like SQL injection attempts or things like that.
Gotcha.
Now, layer 4 firewalls, they're a bit more basic.
Okay.
They work at the transport layer.
Right.
And they mainly look at the IP addresses and port numbers.
Okay.
They're like the traffic cops.
Okay.
They make sure the traffic is flowing to the right places, but they don't really look inside the packets.
So they're not as sophisticated.
No, not as much.
And relying on only a layer 4 firewall could leave you vulnerable.
Right, because if an attack is hidden within the application data,
yeah,
a layer 4 firewall wouldn't see it.
Okay, so it's like a customs agent only checking the outside of a package.
Exactly.
Instead of opening it up to see what's inside.
Right.
Okay, what about those UTM and NGFW things?
So unified threat management devices and next-generation firewalls.
Yeah.
They're kind of like the all-in-one security appliances.
Yeah.
They offer a bunch of different security features all packed into one device.
Right.
Like traditional firewalling, intrusion prevention, anti-malware, content filtering, all that stuff.
Wow, so they're pretty comprehensive.
They are. They're very powerful tools.
But are there any downsides?
Well, if you deploy them alongside other security devices, like a fully active NGFW,
okay,
you can run into some issues.
Okay, like what?
Well, you might end up with conflicting rules or overlapping features, which can make management more complex.
Oh, so it can be a bit of a headache.
Yeah, it can get messy.
And what about only activating certain UTM features when a threat is detected?
Right, so some people do that to try and keep things simple.
Yeah.
But the problem is, during those periods when the features are inactive, you're vulnerable.
Oh, because the attacker might get in before the threat is detected.
Exactly. It's like leaving your alarm system off until you hear someone breaking in.
Not a good strategy.
Not at all.
And when it comes to firewall rules, what's the best way to manage those?
So the most effective approach is to base your firewall rules on solid threat intelligence.
Okay, what does that mean?
So that means using information about known attack patterns, malicious IP addresses, things like that.
Right, keeping your rules up to date.
Exactly. So you're not just blindly blocking traffic.
Yeah.
You're specifically targeting known threats.
Okay, so proactive, not reactive.
Exactly. And on the flip side, you never want to just disable firewall rules because they seem inconvenient or allow all traffic through, just to make things easier.
Yeah, that's like opening all the doors and windows.
It is. You're basically saying, come on in, attackers.
Not a good idea.
No, not at all.
Okay, now we have to talk about remote access.
Okay.
Which is a huge part of the modern workplace. So how does transport layer security, TLS, help secure those remote desktop connections?
So TLS is a cryptographic protocol that encrypts the data that's being sent between the user's remote desktop client and the server they're connecting to. So it's like creating a secure tunnel that prevents anyone from eavesdropping on the communication.
And that's crucial.
It is. You don't want someone sniffing your remote desktop traffic.
Absolutely not.
And one big mistake is disabling firewall rules just to allow remote desktop connections.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because that's basically bypassing a crucial security control.
Right. You're opening a big hole in your defenses.
Exactly. And VPNs, they're great for creating secure tunnels.
Yeah.
But you have to make sure that the tunnel itself is using strong encryption.
Oh, okay.
Because a VPN without encryption
Yeah.
is not really a secure tunnel.
Right, the data could still be intercepted.
Exactly.
So encryption is key.
It is. It's the foundation of security.
And what about open access to all remote desktop connections?
Oh, that's a big no-no.
Yeah.
You always want to restrict access to only those who absolutely need it.
Right. Limit those entry points.
And always enforce strong authentication.
Right. Make sure you know who's connecting.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about Secure Shell.
SSH.
Yeah, that's often used for remote administration, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Common.
So what are the best practices to keep those connections secure?
Okay, well, one of the best things you can do is use public key authentication.
Okay.
Instead of relying solely on passwords.
Right, because passwords can be guessed or cracked.
Exactly. And public key authentication is much more secure.
Okay.
It uses cryptography to verify the user's identity.
Gotcha.
You should also make sure you're using SSH version 2.
Okay.